Now, you may have wondered why we have called you here together in this auspicious occasion. This is actually the 200th anniversary of the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. This eruption is what we now believe to be the largest that had ever occurred in recorded history time. Nice drawing of it that popped up on the internet while I was putting this together. What significance could this volcano that erupted out in the other side of the world have to do with what we're doing? Well, this volcano eruption was so large that it sent all of this ash and soot into the air, which over the next 6-8 months circled the globe. And it created what had come to be known as the year without the summer, or as one writer put it, the haunted summer. And it affected, in particular, a group of British poets and writers who had gone to Geneva for their summer, were planning to spend their summer playing on Lake Geneva. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and the woman there is Mary Shelley. So instead of getting to play on Lake Geneva, they had to spend much of their time inside the house they had rented there on the lakefront, and to entertain themselves while it was storming outside and the weather was horrible. They decided to write ghost stories for each other. Of course, Mary Shelley composed the first chapter of Frankenstein for one of their storytelling sessions. Now, joining these more famous people was a rather obscure character named John William Polidori. Polidori, interesting fellow in and of himself. If you've never heard of Polidori or haven't read about him, there's a new book out called The Poet and the Vampire, which a very, very fine book, very readable story of what happened that summer. Polidori, as it turns out, an interesting character in and of himself. He was a child prodigy. At 21, he had graduated from the medical school at Edinburgh, moved to London to set up his medical practice, only to discover that there was this law in London that you could not practice medicine until you were at least 30 years old. So here he was with his medical degree and his outstanding report from Edinburgh, but couldn't get a job. So he took a job with Lord Byron to accompany him when Byron had to leave England. He went on his tour of Europe and wound up in Geneva. So he is among those people at Geneva who are sitting around listening to each other tell ghost stories. But he's also an aspiring author himself, and it is his task to write the first English language vampire story that was called simply The Vampire. Now, he did not write it while he was at Geneva, because about the time they're telling the ghost stories, he and Lord Byron have a falling out. Now, the importance of Polidori at Geneva is that while he is called the doctor, and he was there and serving all the functions of the doctor, the other important function that he was serving is that he was Lord Byron's drug dealer. He was the guy who knew about all the drugs that were available and about their psychodynamic effects. So when they get together to tell ghost stories, he has supplied them all with drugs so that they can have the appropriate atmosphere in which to share these. But he and Lord Byron, who thought that that Polidori was a horrible writer, and he made no bones about telling him frequently how bad his writing was. After their falling out, he returns to England and he writes The Vampire. To get it published, he tells the publisher the story of their falling out. The publisher actually publishes The Vampire under Lord Byron's name. And Lord Byron will spend the rest of his life distancing himself from this tale. The copy of the magazine it was originally published in finds its way to Germany, and Goethe writes a review of it saying, "This is the best thing Lord Byron's ever written." So that's how vampire studies get started. How do I get into all of this? Well, I was born in 1942 at a very early age. As a teenager, I got turned on by vampires. I started reading science fiction, and I started reading horror. Then I discovered vampires, and just got into it and started collecting vampire comics and vampire books, and spending all of my spare time with vampires. I went off to seminary and got my seminary degree and then my PhD at Northwestern. And I'm in my graduate school days, right at the time that vampires begin to make a revival and begin to come out and all. You may remember it's in the late 60s, The Dark Shadows shows up on television. It's 69 when Vampirella, the comic magazine, first appears. But while I'm in Chicago at Northwestern, running around as a grad student, I meet this fellow. This is Marty Ricardo. This is a not too recent, but a much more recent one. When I met him, he was still a young man in his 20s. I met him at a psychic convention. He's a hypnotist in his day job, but founded one of the oldest of the vampire-related fan clubs. And very intelligent kind of guy, but he liked to collect. And so I got to know him and the people he had brought together as a vampire fan club there in Chicago. And Marty and I have stayed friends since then. We still correspond a couple of times a week. He's written a couple of books at that point. But it's right at this time that what we call vampire studies is really getting off the ground. And it's to these three people that we owe the fact that we are here today talking about what we are discussing. This is Raymond McNally, Radu Florescu, and Leonard Wolf. Wolf was living in California at the time and wrote this book, A Dream of Dracula, in which he talks about teaching Dracula and vampire studies as part of a course that he taught at the college as a young scholar. McNally and Florescu is a Romanian. They're both Eastern European historians, or both were. They're both deceased now. Radu just died a few months ago. Wrote this book, In Search of Dracula, in which they begin to tie Count Dracula to Vlad the Impaler. It's hard to think that is a relatively new idea. A few Romanians had done it, but this was the first time it had really popped up in English. This book became a bestseller. It went through 4 editions within a year or two. Dream of Dracula went through several editions. And what this book in particular did was to make the study of Dracula something legitimate within the academic setting. Heretofore, it had been something a few people in Gothic studies had done, but here were some historians at Boston University talking about Dracula. Leonard moved to New York University, has been there ever since, still in New York. So they brought the power of their institutions with them and began to grow things. This is one of the signs of the popularity that McNally and Florescu's book had, Gail Kimberly's book was the first novel in which Vlad becomes a character. Comes out in 1972, just a year and a half after In Search of Dracula. This, of course, is Vlad Dracula, the Romanian ruler from the 15th century. I myself finished up my doctoral studies and began to write books, and would spend the next 25 years of my life basically earning my living as a writer. I thought how ironic it was. I was the guy who struggled with English. I got through college pretty much making all A's, but in English that was where I fell down and had my B's. I published my dissertation, and the fact of publishing that dissertation and doing some other stuff out of it led me to this man. The head of Gale Research, he's the publisher of the largest reference book publishing house in the world. He took me under his wing and hired me to begin to write books for Gale Research, and then introduced me to Les Shepard. Now, I knew Les because he had done an encyclopedia of occultism, and the first time I'm in Detroit, I meet Les, discover that he is also the guy who founds the Bram Stoker Society in Ireland. He's an Irishman, and that's one of the oldest of the British vampire groups, and had done this book of among several others that he did. So Les and I struck up a friendship, and my days with working on vampires was coming along. And then I met Massimo in Trevigno. Massimo is from northern Italy. He lives in Turin. I met him because we both worked in an area called New Religions. That is, we studied all the groups that were popularly called cults at the time. And Massimo was getting new religious studies going in Europe and invited me to come over to Turin. As we began to work together during the 1980s, I discovered he was also interested in Dracula and vampire studies. That's his book that he had put out in Italian. So as we began to talk about vampires among ourselves, we discovered other new religion scholars were interested in vampires. And then finally, my work with Gale Research led me to 1992. 1992, Fred Ruffner, the man whose picture there was there, and I couldn't remember his name, had sold Gale Research, and my contract was up. So they called me into Detroit and said, "What do you want to do? Along with the items we have planned for you to write, what would you like to write?" So I made a list of items, one of which was an encyclopedia of vampires. The reason I wanted to do an encyclopedia is because as I had begun to collect and read a lot of the nonfiction books that had been done in the 70s and 80s, I figured out you can write just about anything you want to about vampires. You don't have to footnote it. You don't have to verify it. It doesn't have to be true. You can just write it. And so I said I'd like to do an encyclopedia of vampires and kind of set the record straight. They said, fine, go at it. So this happens in 1992 is when Coppola's Dracula comes out. And as they're considering writing me a contract for this encyclopedia, Coppola's movie comes out and a front page story in the Wall Street Journal pops up and says, this is the biggest selling movie that Columbia has ever done. So I dutifully clipped that article and sent it into Detroit and said, show this to your marketing people. that took me, they wrote me a contract in 1992, and so I wrote into the contract, I want to go to Romania. So they sent me to Romania, and when I'm in Romania, I meet this fellow. This is Nicky Patararu. Nicky had been the tourism guy under the Ceausescu regime, which had just fallen. 93 is when I get to go. I meet Nicky while I'm there. He is the founder of the Transylvanian Society of Dracula, whose symbol is posted there. So in Bucharest, he shows me around the remaining Dracula sites, and in Bucharest there are not too many. They're all up in the Carpathians up north. But I begin to make that contact, and I tell him, you know, the anniversary of the publication of Dracula is coming up. We should plan something for that. Well, Nicky's trying to raise money for the new Romanian government. He said, well, we're not going to wait for that. And so he goes ahead and on his own organizes the first Dracula conference. Meanwhile, my books begin to appear. This is the first edition of the vampire book that came out in '94. I'm very, very fortunate with this because it came out just as Interview with the Vampire hit the movie theaters, and it took off. The only time I've ever seen one of my books in a bookstore window. We were in New Orleans for Halloween, and I walking around, there's a big display, and there's my book. And because of this one having some success, I was able to write the other two in fairly rapid succession. This then brought me in contact with this fellow. This is a fellow by the name of Robert 18 Passain. Rob lives in White Rock, British Columbia, just south of Vancouver, and he had the most fabulous collection of vampire books going. He had been a very serious collector for about 15 years at the time I met him in the early 90s, and it was actually seeing Rob's collection and being able to go up to Vancouver and spend time in his collection. He had tracked down a lot of vampire books that did not have the word Dracula or vampire in the title, and hence relatively unknown. And we started saying that what we need is a comprehensive bibliography of all this material. Now, this is 1992. We did not know about what was going to happen to vampire books, and that the growth that we were seeing beginning to appear in the early 90s was not only going to continue, but was going to rapidly increase over the next couple of decades. So for the last 20 years, we have been working together to compile bibliographies and try to make what's happening in vampire studies available to people. Rob is in the process right now of selling his collection. That's been an unfortunate thing that's happening. Meeting Rob then led me to Elizabeth Miller. Elizabeth Miller, another Canadian, lived out in Newfoundland, but had just at this point retired from her career as an English professor. She's now Professor Emeritus. Still going strong, and has become one of the most outstanding of the Dracula scholars. Written a half dozen books and I don't know how many papers running around. Jeannie Youngston was someone that Marty Ricardo introduced me to along the way. She founded the oldest of the vampire fan clubs. It was called the Count Dracula Society. It's now called the Vampire Empire. But Jeannie had gone to Romania back in the 70s. There was a very brief period in the 1970s when Ceausescu, who was the dictator of Romania at the time, decided that in order to improve the economy, they needed some tourists, and they had this vampire thing happening, so why not exploit it? And so for 5 minutes in the middle of the 1970s, they did that. They actually had brought in a television crew to film a program with Hamilton, George Hamilton, who had starred in yeah, back in '79, and Love at First Bite. But Jeannie went to that event that had been filmed up in Borgo Pass, and had come home from that to found the Count Dracula fan club, and was going strong. The fan club itself has shrunk now, and it's what's left of it is only a group of people in New York City. But she's been very, very active over the years and in doing various things. So all of a sudden, in the 1990s, things begin to grow as we head toward 1997. 1997 was the 100th anniversary of the publication of Dracula. There were several programs that were put on that year. The big one was in Los Angeles. It was called Dracula 97. We had about 100 scholars who came and gave papers over a 3 or 4 day period. We had some evening programs with some stars. Ingrid Pitt came from Hammer Movies. The Dark Shadow stars showed up, and we had a lot of fun for 3 or 4 days. We all expected at that point that things were going to kind of collapse. We thought we had seen publishing had been very active in the 70s, had sort of died out in the mid-80s. Vampires had been banished from the Marvel comic book universe. Vampire movies went through a period there just weren't any being made in the mid-80s. In '85, there were only 2 vampire novels published that year. But then we saw things starting to build in the late '80s, and they continued to build through the '90s. By 1992, we were getting a vampire novel every week in the English language. So there was a little over 50 vampire novels published in 1992. And we thought this was going to continue up until '97, that's what it was aiming for, and as soon as 1997 happened, everything would die away. That was, of course, not what happened. At this point, in 1997, Rob Hussain and I began to talk about our big project that we were going to work on. We wanted to track the permeation of Western culture by the vampire myth. And the work product was going to be a comprehensive bibliography and filmography of English language vampire literature, cinema, and television, and continue the maintenance of the vampire book into more editions. At that point, there was only the first edition that had come out. And we noted that at this point that the 1992 Coppola movie was an important event that had happened. We didn't know how important it was until later, but we had begun to recognize it. We recognized it as we began to look at the movies that followed it. First, Blade came out. Blade was a kind of a precursor to a lot of the superhero movies. Blade was a character that had been created in the 1970s. He was just an ordinary guy. He was strong. He knew about vampires. He was half a vampire himself. But once Marvel began to rework him in the 1990s, he emerged as a real superhero. His muscles got bigger. His strength, his powers increased, and then by the time he gets to the movie, this becomes one of the best-selling movies of the year. It pops up after it is published it. It is the best-selling vampire movie ever in the 6 months after it's released. Then come the Underworld series. The Underworld series sells more than the Blade series, and it becomes the best-selling series. And then the remake of I Am Legend comes along. I Am Legend is now one of the best-selling vampire movies of all time. It's, I think, number 4 on the list, even at this point in time. Then the real thing that begins to happen is, of course, Anne Rice and Stephen King. It's hard to imagine now that Interview with a Vampire was released back in the 1970s. It sold pretty well, but it didn't make any of the bestseller lists, and it didn't win any awards. Same is true of Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot is released back in the 70s. It doesn't win any awards. Comes close on one, loses out to I Am Legend on one award, but doesn't make any of the bestseller lists. It's only in the late 80s that King and Rice publish vampire books that make it on the bestseller list and get to the top. Anne Rice's Vampire Lestat, which comes out in the late 80s, does not debut on the bestseller list, but quickly gets on the bestseller list and quickly makes its way to number 1. The first of the Stephen King vampire novels is one called The Tommyknockers, the first of his vampire novels that makes it on the bestseller list. It's the fourth of the Vampire Chronicles series that Anne Rice finally debuts at number 1, and then all of her novels after The Tale of the Body Thief are number 1 on the bestseller list. By the time that King gets around to writing the Dark Tower series, each of it, Song of Susanna is his sequel to Salem's Lot. And it debuts at number 1. By this time, everything Stephen King is writing debuts at number 1 on the bestseller list. So the 3 volumes that are specifically vampire novels in the Dark Tower series, all 3, the first of them being the Song of Susanna, debut at number 1. So the things are heating up, and Anne Rice has a lot to do with what's happening. Once the vampires are encased on the bestseller list, a number of other authors begin to appear who also make it. And in particular, there's something that has happened. It happens back in the late 60s, gets established in the early 70s, but in the 90s really makes its impact. And this is the new vampire characters that are created. Up until the late 60s, there's only one vampire character. It's the vampire bad guy monster. But in the late 60s, 2 other characters are added to it. One is what we call the good guy vampire, which you've all now become familiar with. The good guy vampire is the vampire who's happy that he or she is a vampire, has found a way to live as a vampire without killing people all the time, or at least killing only an occasional bad guy who's really worse than a bad vampire. The other is the conflicted vampire. This is the vampire who retains enough of his humanity that knows he has to survive by killing people and drinking their blood, but is upset about that and has to opine about it all the time. The first good guy vampire is actually Vampirella. Vampirella appears as a comic book character. The first of the conflicted vampires is Barnabas Collins of Dark Shadows. But in the 1970s, these reach novels. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough begins to publish her series with Saint Germain. That's now about 30 books in that series. She's been very, very successful at it. Fred Saberhagen publishes A Good Guy, Dracula. If you haven't read the Dracula tape, that's one of the great Dracula novels all times, where Dracula does his apology of why he's really a good guy. And then, of course, Anne Rice and Lestat begin to make that happen. Within the world of the good guy vampires, that gets established in romantic literature. Laurel Hamilton, Sherilyn Kenyon, Raquel Mead, all very, very successful. All of their books by the beginning of the new century are appearing on the bestseller list. Laurel Hamilton, Sherilyn Kenyon kind of lead in the romantic field, while Mead is one of the several who begin to introduce vampires to youth. In the 70s, they're the first vampire book actually written for a young audience is published. So vampires become big in children's literature and in young adult literature, and Mead's books are right at the top of that list. And as vampire books show up and become popular and become bestsellers, among the ones that get to the top of the bestseller list, this one is my favorite. James Patterson's Violets Are Blue. I was not even aware of it for a while. Patterson is a popular mystery writer, and I'm not a fan of reading mystery books. But one day I get a call from a colleague of mine, up in Toronto, who says, "Gordon, have you read this book? It sounds like you're in it." And he turns to chapter 29 and begins to read it, and it turns out I'm the bad guy in this book. And I've tried on 2 occasions to meet Mr. Patterson. Both times weather prevented it. But I hold this up for you if you want to see my other side. It's still a fairly easy book to get a hold of. But the real thing that happens that killed all of our predictions about what was going to happen to vampires in 1997 is Buffy and Company. Sorry, we are going to talk a little bit about Buffy at this point. Right on the heels of our big Dracula conference in 97, Buffy comes to television. We had no great expectations for the televised Buffy. We had all seen the Buffy movie that had been made in the early 90s that was mediocre at best. But we all, because this was the only thing happening with vampires supposedly after Dracula 97, we all tuned in and were amazed at what Joss Whedon had done. This movie begins to build an audience, first among young adults and then among adults. It creates a whole new world of scholarship that we'll get to in a minute, but it then builds a television audience that's eager for vampires. There had not been a really successful vampire series since Forever Night had its 3-year run and then got killed by CBS taking it over from the Canadian company that had originated it. So while vampires are becoming very, very big, I'm sorry about that. While vampires are becoming very, very big on television, they are continuing in the movies. And after the Blade and Underworld series come along, finally the Twilight series is hit. Now, the Twilight books have been made possible by the fact that there is this whole set of young adult vampire series that are coming along. And then all of a sudden, Steffi Meyer creates this series. If one wanted to be an apologist for this series, one would say, this is a great series. It's a wonderful series of books if you happen to be a 13-year-old female. If you are anything else, it's hard to get through it. But the series goes on and is now in literature. This is one of the 50 best-selling literature fiction series that has ever been produced. Only Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles are on that list, along with the Twilight series of those 50 best-selling books. And then, of course, the movies make it. At the time that the 5th movie comes out, of the 5 best-selling movies going, 4 of them are on that list. 2 of them remain on the top 10 best-selling movies of all time, in spite of the blockbusters that have come out since then. And these movies, along with I Am Legend, are the best-selling, in terms of income produced, best-selling vampire movies of all time. Now, I want to end with a more social scientific note. We just published, finally, the first volume of the work out of what Rob and I and Massimo have been doing for the last 20 years. This is kind of a graph showing the development of vampire studies. From 1800 to 1900, very few studies appear. Begins to grow after the publication of the Montague Summers books. Main studies are in psychology and folklore. It's in the 1970s it begins to take off. This is sort of like the population curve, except here it begins to grow faster than the population. So that out of, we're up above 6,000 articles now, articles and books that we've located in vampire studies. This kind of gives you some of the totals. There are about 6,000 entries in the book that was just released. Of those, from 1900 to when we shut things off a couple of years ago, the number of items on Dracula remained the largest at 1,400. So in 113 years, you get a little over 1,400 items. Vampire studies became Buffy studies for about 10 years. So in the 13 years from the beginning of the century, first Buffy articles come out in '99. We already have 1,269 articles, and the number of Buffy articles is not diminishing that much yet. There's still a biannual Buffy conference that attracts 150, 200 people. Next one will be next summer in London. It draws people from all over, Australia, South Africa, etc. So I will stop at that point, and with that kind of overview of where I came from and where vampire studies originated. I've been very, very fortunate to be a part of it as a person who participates in vampire studies. The title of my presentation came to me. It is not something that, as a writer of nonfiction literature, as a scholar who thinks of himself as a part-time vampirologist, it is as yet nothing that you can do full-time. You have to have something else to produce your income. So that's why I said, if you're interested in vampire studies, don't quit your day job. Thank you. if you have any questions or comments, or you're not allowed to throw things. Yes.
Well, as we know, Dark Shadows had a werewolf character, and I have heard that some people have created the idea that you get zombies from vampires that don't get fed. Have you looked at these these other kind of preternatural beings?
I've looked at them a little bit. In my work, one of the things that I wanted to do was to track the different vampire characters around the world. That was such a big task that in order to keep myself focused, I had to say, not going to look at vampires, not going to look at zombies, and definitely not going to collect. The major tales out of Romania is the vampire comes from the werewolf character in Romanian folklore, and there's some relationship to various kinds of weird animals, and they show up in some of the same cultures where vampires do. Zombies I look upon as kind of a modern creation of Haitian colonialism, and have just never gotten really interested in either the werewolf, and especially not in the zombie, and try to avoid them as much as possible, to be quite honest.
You brought up I Am Legend as a vampire movie, and I've only ever seen the Will Smith movie, and I thought it was just when I briefly watched that it was more of a zombie-leaning movie. Is the book more representative of the creatures and vampires versus more
Yeah,
of the
the novel is a vampire novel.
Okay.
It's written before zombies become popular, and it's a vampire apocalypse novel. It's been made into a movie 3 times, and 2 of the 3 times it pretty much becomes a zombie movie. I Am Legend, the Will Smith version. Do you remember the vampires at all?
A little bit. I mean, I watched it when it first came out, and I guess comparing it to like the Brad Pitt zombie movie, that's just what I remember is that last scene where they're in the lab and they just seem like the mindless kind of zombie creatures.
Nope.
But
The vampires are the dogs. As he's walking the streets, the dogs come out, and they are the vampires. The vampire characters from the novel are turned into zombies. And it's a vampire movie because of the dogs and because of the history of the novel. That's part of the interesting part of it. But you're quite right. In the movies, they tend to want to turn them into zombies. Yeah.
Have you seen the movie Daybreakers?
Yes.
Yes, you have? Okay. I found that as an interesting angle on vampires. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. Part of what happens when vampires become a popular topic is you start running out of storylines. That's something I think that had happened by the 1960s. So they had to come up with some new storylines. And one of them had to do with one of the questions you always have is how do vampires deal with the daylight? And so already in the 1970s, you're getting questions being raised about are there possibilities of vampires moving about in daytime? And that has become a major theme that vampire writers and screenwriters can play with now. And so you get some of them where night's not a problem, some where daytime is not a problem, some where daytime inhibits them a little bit but doesn't destroy them, and then all the way over to, you have to remember that in Dracula walks around in the daytime in the novel, and it's not until one of the sequels to Dracula is done by Republic Studios that Dracula gets melted in the sun and becomes part of the repertoire. Well, it does back in old Nosferatu, but that had been suppressed. And that Bela Lugosi film where he dissolves in the sunlight after he leaves Universal.
I thought the more interesting angle of Daybreakers was the fact that what we had was, if you consider vampires turning people into vampires over time versus consuming human life, that eventually you're going to have a population of vampires with very, very few humans to feed off of.
Right.
And that can become a problem.
Yeah, and that also is a theme that gets taken up in the novels early on. McCallum writes one. What's the one where it takes place in Los Angeles?
Night Thirst.
Yes, and that becomes a problem. That's a fairly traditional theme that followed up in Daybreak. Yes, ma'am.
Terry Pratchett has a character in his Discworld series, which is, by the time this character came out, the Discworld series became very heavy on social commentary as well as comedy, called Lady Margolata, who is not only a vampire, who has figured out how to live without human blood, but also leads a 12-step group.
Yes.
And is very heavily involved in the politics of the area where she lives, which is actually supposed to be kind of a dramatic Slavic area. When did authors start using vampire characters in less than serious applications like Pratchett did?
There's so many out. When did they? Fairly early, certainly in the 70s. You would.
Love at First Bite was comedy.
Yeah, that's 79, and Saber. I think Saberhagen's is the first that I ran into, where the Dracula take is in one sense it's a very serious novel making an apology for Dracula, but on another level it is hilarious.
There's a Bugs Bunny cartoon too, where he says abracadabra and Dracula's trying to.
Right. Yeah, there's a set of early cartoons that actually go back to the 30s, where there's a humorous take on it. Mighty Mouse, and, 5 or 6 of them that come along at different times. All right. Thank you.